If you think your garden is limited by shade, think again. There's almost no garden that's entirely shade-free. Right here I have peppers and tomatoes growing in some morning shade. So in today's video, Jacques and I are going to give you our suggestions for what to grow in the shade, from main crops to leafy greens to herbs to perennials and even some root crops. But before we get into the first pick, we have to define the 4 different lighting conditions a garden can have. So to do that, let's go to the backyard. My in-ground garden in the backyard is what's considered a full sun garden. I am standing right in the middle of it. It's about 9:30 a.m. right now and I'm getting blasted by the sun. 6 to 8 hours of sun is considered full sun, especially if that sunlight occurs between peak sunlight hours, which would be 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. But to know you have full sun, it's pretty self-explanatory, but in general, wide open spaces with a lot of southern exposure will be full sun. Next up, we have partial sun. That's 3 to 6 hours of sunlight a day. I chose this spot next to my apple and pomegranate tree as an example because there's a huge loquat tree that's about 15 feet tall on the southern side of this area. So I would say about half the day this is blocked, but the other half of the day, it's completely exposed. Now we have partial shade, which weirdly is one of my favorite places to establish a garden. This is my artichoke patch, but I also have some other stuff growing here, like a bougainvillea and some other ornamentals that thrive in this lighting condition, which is about 3 hours of sun a day. And the reason this is partial shade is because I have an east and a south wall that are about 20 feet tall, blocking sun until later in the afternoon, so well past those peak sunlight hours. This won't see a lick of sun until about 2 or 3 p.m., but I can still grow a ton of stuff. Finally, you have full shade, and it doesn't necessarily mean no light whatsoever, but it's barely any direct sunlight. So I'm here underneath my loquat tree. You can see nothing is really growing under here, and it'll get less than 3 hours a day. And if it does get light, it's kind of dappled through a canopy or through some sort of thing that is filtering that light. There is still some stuff you can grow in full shade, but it's not your first choice.
The first category of plants that we're going to talk about growing in the shade is the main crop category. These are like the things that take up the majority of your plate when you harvest them, the primary vegetable of your meal, and a really good example of ones that do well in the shade are the brassica family. So think about broccoli, cauliflower, Romanesco. All of those can handle partial sun, meaning 4 to 6 hours of sun is plenty for them to still produce. They will produce a little bit smaller, grow a little bit slower, but my main plan here is to actually plant them within my pepper beds. These are my summer beds where I actually have a lot of shade casted down from these pepper plants. And this section of my garden also gets into deep shade in the afternoon thanks to this giant calamansi tree above me. So at the beginning, I'll start my brassicas in between my summer crops, let them grow, remove the peppers once that season's over, and allow them to fill in their space. The other sort of main crop that does really well is actually things like peas. This area right here goes into full shade in about an hour or two and makes it 4 to 6 hours of sun overall, especially in the winter. The cool thing about peas is that as they grow, they'll reach for that sun. So even though this lower portion will be in full shadow, by the time the peas get up to here, they'll be able to reach the sun even late in the afternoon. When it comes to choosing varieties for the peas, try to choose something taller so it could really reach for the sun. For the brassicas, I really like the floret producing broccoli heads. Things like Belstar are really good, or burgundy broccoli that produce a lot of florets and side shoots instead of one main head. And for cauliflowers, I like to choose faster growing varieties like Twister, Snowball Y, and Romanesco. Any is good because it hates the sun and wants to grow in the shade. There is one more main crop that actually can handle some shade, and that is the glorious bush bean. I have 2 varieties for you right here, Contender and Blue Lake 274. These are both varieties that produce really, really well. They're vigorous producers, which means that they will also produce well in the shade, because what happens when you give some partial shade to plants is they just grow a little bit slower and produce a little bit less. So you want to choose a vigorous variety to offset that. In this case, these get shade because I'm right up against this fence line and I have a short bed, and right around like 3 o'clock in the evening, this will be almost in full shade, and that morning sun is all these beans need to grow and produce. And as you can see, they're quite healthy with just a little bit of morning sun.
Let's enter the world of root crops, starting with beets. I would recommend growing a red beet in partial sun and especially in partial shade. So Robin and Early Wonder are good. They're just quicker to maturity, about 50 days or so. The golden beets take longer, like maybe 80 days. And what I've noticed is planting in partial sun or shade probably doubles the amount of time it takes the beet to grow, but they're still very delicious. Jacques has some planted in a shady spot of his garden. They got to full size, the same as the ones planted in full sun. It just took a little bit longer. Then you've got carrots, and this is a true definition of a partial shade bed right here. Carrots are great for partial sun, I would say, but they will thrive in partial shade. Just again, takes a little bit longer. The one benefit though to growing carrots in a not so sunny environment is that it's easier to germinate them. That's in fact the hardest part, especially for beginner gardeners to grow carrots, is because once they germinate, they're very sensitive and they can take a little bit of time to establish themselves. So they die a lot with one day maybe of drying out. So growing them in partial shade can work really well. Little finger is a quick growing variety if you want something that goes fast. Then you have radish, which is probably the best root crop to grow in the shade. It actually wants a little bit of shade, especially in that late afternoon sun. Heat plus radishes equals a very bitter, overly spicy and woody radish, which you do not want to eat. So I like planting radish in sort of the under canopy of my annual garden because it's gonna get maybe partial shade at the most, like underneath these eggplants or underneath this amaranth. And then you just mess around with so many different varieties of radish. There's blends, Easter egg blend's a good one, but there's like dozens of different types of radishes you can grow from all around the world, and they work very well in almost all lighting conditions.
We've covered a lot of really delicious plant groups that can thrive and grow in the shade, but there is one really big, expansive group of plants that love the shade so much that I always make sure to start their seeds under shade cloth, and that is things that are leafy greens. For example, I have two right here for you, arugula, lettuce. These are both plants that if you grow them in too much sun, they will actually start to taste bitter and lose some of those subtle qualities that we really like about them. For example, the arugula won't be so nutty anymore. Instead, it'll just be kind of bitter. Same with the lettuce. If you've ever had bitter lettuce, you know it's not that fun to eat in salads. So go for something like partial shade up to partial sun. They will taste better, they'll grow better, they'll last longer, and they won't bolt. So those are just two of the leafy greens that I have, but I have a couple more in the garden I want to show you that I really like to grow in the shade. This right here is my lacinato kale plant, and it is growing right now in what appears to be full sun, but this is only morning sun. As I alluded to earlier, I have this huge calamansi tree behind me, and by like 2 o'clock in the afternoon, this will be in full shade. So it's really only getting some morning sun, and that depends on all of its neighbors like this grape as well. Lacinato kale is a great multi-purpose one. It could grow in partial shade, go up to partial sun, but I also really like the red Russian kale for growing and throwing into salads, and the curly kale for growing and using in soups. Now there is another plant that this year I decided to plant in full sun because why not? Usually it tolerates it quite well, but in this case we had a 103-degree heat wave, and that roasted my perpetual spinach chard. This is by far my favorite chard variety. It could still handle intense sun and heat and will grow fine. It'll just have to wait for the new leaves to emerge. But this is one that, again, it can handle all ranges of conditions. Partial shade is totally fine. I had one growing in partial shade all winter long. I didn't get as much production as I wanted, but it was still really reliable and delicious to eat. But there is one plant that I will never plant in full sun, and that is the choy family. Things like bok choy, tatsoi. Every time I do put them in full sun, they bolt before I even get anything to harvest. So what I would recommend is stick to partial shade only. Do not go over like 3 hours of sun. I like to bury them in the deeper back half of my bed behind tall mature plants so they get plenty of shade and cool weather. But I also wanted to add that any leafy green can tolerate shade. Anything that doesn't fruit like that, if you have a favorite green, try growing it in some shade. It'll probably do just fine.
Let's get into some perennials that work in shade. My favorite, you might be sick of it by now, but it's artichokes. I love these guys. This is a partial shade area of my garden. They do very well here. In fact, when they're grown commercially, they're grown up in Monterey, California area, which is coastal, very foggy, very overcast, and that's where they're grown for grocery stores, so it works really well. The beauty of the artichoke, these are the leaves. They get massive when they're bigger. They can collect a lot of sunlight and they propagate themselves. That's why they are perennials. So you can see I have one plant here, there's another one offshooting right here. I've had this patch for about 3.5 to 4 years now, and I've never replanted my artichokes, and they come back every single year. Only thing you gotta remember is that you're eating an unopened flower, so they don't need a ton of energy. You're not really letting them get to their full potential because you're cutting that flower head off before it blooms. So artichokes have to be my favorite shade-tolerant perennial. Then we have asparagus, which grows in full sun and does really want full sun if you can give it to it, but it can tolerate partial sun. This is a crop that once it's here, it's here. It's gonna be here for about 10, 20, sometimes even 30 years. So be careful where you plant it. But like I mentioned, 4 to 6 hours of sun, it will tolerate that. It just wants to get that during the spring and summer months, because of course, as the season goes on, sunlight hours change, the angle of the sun changes, and sometimes the shadows change as it throws across your garden. So if it does get a little more shade in a particular season, you want that season to be winter because there won't be any asparagus up to grow.
One of my favorite perennial plants is rhubarb, and rhubarb actually loves the shade, especially here in sunny San Diego. This is actually the only sun it gets. It only gets sun in the morning. Even right now it's getting some shade from this part of Madera. But as you can see behind me, I've got this huge Mexican sunflower and fruit trees behind me, and they will fully shadow this in the afternoon. But yet I still get these nice, wonderful stalks of rhubarb that I could turn into pies. Don't worry if you think you could only grow vegetables in the shade, because there is a whole world of flavor from herbs they could also unlock from growing in the shade. In particular, basil is one that, while it can grow in full sun, and of course it'll thrive in full sun, it could also do really well in some partial shade. Where I am on this herb bed right now, I have a huge umbrella that I never put away. So in the evening, it always fully shades this bed, and my basil doesn't seem to mind. Neither does my Thai basil over here. But there is a very troll herb out there that everyone has failed to grow, because you always want to grow it at the time where you have fresh tomatoes to make salsa and to make delicious tacos, and that is cilantro. Now there is a specific variety of cilantro like this one here called long-standing Santo, which is more bolt resistant. And that means that it won't go to flower as fast as standard cilantro. Because when cilantro gets too much sun and too much heat, it'll immediately go to flower, and you won't get any of that delicious leafy green that you actually want to put on your taco. So those are two herbs that do really well in the shade, but I've got a whole list of other ones for you. Mint is another one of those herbs that, of course, it can grow in full sun, but it tends to get a little more tough and even bitter if it gets too hot and too much sun. That's why I have my mint here planted in a pot underneath my other potted trees like my guava and my bay leaf, because they will cast shadow over this, help keep the mint cool, and make it as delicious and refreshing as I want it to be. The other group of herbs that I like to plant in the shade are actually things like, right here I have some fennel, and over here I have some dill that I was actually just thinking about planting right over here. That's because both of these plants already grow kind of spindly and leggy. They don't mind growing even more spindly and leggy. So I'm going to be putting this dill right at the base here in the shade for most of the morning, and it gets a little bit of afternoon sun. But the cool thing is that I'll plant it right underneath my pickling cucumbers, and I'll be able to harvest the dill and use the cucumbers at the same time. And the cucumbers, of course, will cast extra shade on that dill. So both of those are great options, but we actually have a whole playlist of all sorts of different herb information that you could check out right here. But that's all for this video. Good luck in the garden and keep on growing.